Book 5. Equality of enjoyment. I now propose to discuss the second group of conceptions of equality of welfare that is distinguished at the outset, which take equality of welfare to consist in equal amounts or degrees of a conscious state. I shall simplify this discussion, as I said there, by taking the concept of enjoyment to stand for a particularly broad version of the conscious state or states in question. Fortunately, this discussion can be simplified in another way as well, for much of the argument I used in considering unrestricted versions of equality of success apply to unrestricted versions of equality of enjoyment as well. People gain enjoyment, as I said, from the satisfaction of their political and impersonal preferences as well as directly and from their personal preferences, and they suffer dissatisfaction when these political and impersonal preferences are defeated. But the same considerations that argue for a restricted form of equality of success, which does not count success or failure in achieving these preferences in the calculations that theory recommends, argue for similar restrictions in equality of enjoyment. So I shall assume that equality of enjoyment, as a theory of equality in distribution, holds that resources should be distributed so far as possible so that people are equal in the enjoyment they take directly and from their beliefs that their personal preferences are achieved. My first argument against this restricted version of equality of enjoyment is also modeled on the argument I used against equality of relative success. The main appeal of a restricted form of equality of enjoyment lies in the claim that it makes people equal in what they all value equally and fundamentally, so far as their personal position is concerned. But that appeal cannot be sustained because in fact people differ in the importance each attaches to enjoyment, even in the widest sense that leaves that term a description of conscious states. When they are made equal in that one respect, they become unequal in other respects many value much more. For almost everyone, pain or dissatisfaction is an evil and makes life less desirable and valuable. For almost everyone, pleasure or enjoyment of some other form is of value and contributes to the desirability of life. Conscious states of some such form, positive and negative, figure as components of everyone's conception of the good life, but only as components, because almost no one pursues only enjoyment or will make any large sacrifice or of something else he values to avoid a small amount of pain. And different people give even these conscious states very different weight. Two scholars, for example, may both value creative work, but one may be willing to give up more by way of social pleasure or the enjoyments of reputation or the satisfaction that comes from completing a piece of research well done, to do work that is in fact more original. Someone might now object that the first scholar does not value enjoyment less, but rather finds it in a different source, not in the delights of society or the glow of fame, but in the deeper satisfactions of the pursuit of genuine discovery. But this is plainly not necessarily or even usually so. Some of the most ambitious scholars and artists and statesmen and athletes set off in a direction that they predict will bring them only failure, and they know that they will find no delight or satisfaction just in the fact that they are aiming high, but only misery in how far they have fallen short. They may truly say, in the spirit of the poet whose views I described earlier, that they wish that some goal or project had not occurred to them or fallen in their path, or that they did not have the talents that made it necessary for them to pursue it, because then their lives would have been more satisfactory, more enjoyable, all things considered. It perverts their report, misunderstands their complex situation, to say that they have actually found more enjoyment in the life they have led. For it is exactly their point that they have led that life in spite of, rather than for, the quality of the conscious life it has brought them. Now, of course, not many people are dedicated to some ambition in that particularly strenuous way, but most of us, I think, are dedicated to something whose value to us is not exhausted or captured in the enjoyment its realization will bring, and some are dedicated to more things in that way, or more strongly dedicated than others. Even when we do enjoy what we have or have done, we often enjoy it because we think it valuable, not vice versa. And we sometimes choose, in the same manner, though not to the same dramatic degree as the most ambitious scholar, a life that we believe will bring less enjoyment because it is in other ways a better life to lead. This is evident, I think, in a psychological fact that in some ways illustrates a different point, but is nevertheless relevant. Suppose you had a genuine choice which, once made, you would forget, between a life in which you in fact achieved some goal important to you, though you did not realize that you had, and a different life in which you falsely believed that you had achieved that goal and therefore had the enjoyment or satisfaction flowing from that belief. See Brent Williams, Egoism and Altruism in Problems of the Self, Cambridge. If you make the former choice, as many would, then you rank enjoyment, however described, as less important than something else important. Suppose someone now says, however, that equality of enjoyment is an attractive political goal, not because people all do value that state equally and fundamentally when they decide what is important for themselves, but rather because they ought to do so. He says not that the ambitious scholar I described really values enjoyment, but rather that he is mistaken, perhaps even irrational, because he does not. Someone making this objection, that is, abandons what I said is the immediate appeal of any conception of equality or of welfare, which is that it claims to make people equal in what they value equally and fundamentally. He argues that the appeal of that political ideal is rather that it makes people equal in what they ought to value equally and fundamentally. We have, I think, two answers. First, he's wrong in his view about what people ought to value. He is wrong in supposing either that the most valuable life is a life of maximum enjoyment, no matter how generously that conscious state is described, or that everyone ought to hold that view of what is the best life. Second, even if that theory about what people ought to value is more plausible than I think, even if it is in fact true, a political theory of equality based on that conception of the good life is an unattractive theory for a society in which many, if not most people, reject that conception, and some reject it as alien to their most profound beliefs about the goodness of their own lives. We may, moreover, find a second argument against the restricted form equality of enjoyment in the arguments we considered against equality of overall success. Though I have emphasized the error in supposing that ambitious people all take enjoyment in their strenuous lives, or pursue those lives for the sake of the enjoyment they will bring, it is nevertheless true that people of ambition often find dissatisfaction in the failure of their grand aims, and in their regret that they do not have the additional resources of talent and means that would make success more likely, whether or not they hold political theories that suppose that they are entitled to more than they have. Though this was not part of my story of Jack and Jill, we might vary that story to suppose, for example, that Jack found keen disappointment and day-to-day dissatisfaction in the fact that he did not have solving the riddle talents and means. But it would seem as wrong to transfer resources to him on account of that greater dissatisfaction as on account of his lower success ratio measured in that way. No one, I think, would want to aim at counting more than the dissatisfaction he found in reasonable regret. But if the arguments I offered earlier are sound, introducing the idea of reasonable regret for the sake of that limitation would introduce a different and inconsistent theory of distribution into the very statement often justification for equality of enjoyment. 6. Objective theories of welfare. The conceptions of equality of welfare, thus far considered, are all subjective in the following sense. They may each be enforced without asking whether a person's own consistent and informed evaluation of how far he meets the deployed standard of welfare is correct. Of course, the arguments in favor of choosing one or another conception of equality of welfare may assume that people are wrong in what they take to be important, or even in what they would take to be important if fully informed of the pertinent facts. We considered, for example, the argument in favor of equality of enjoyment that people ought to value enjoyment as fundamentally important to their lives, in spite of the fact that many do not. But even if the conscious state conception is defended in that way, it may be applied without any evaluation of the enjoyment in question. It directs officials to produce the distribution such that each person takes equal enjoyment in the life he leads, without asking whether people are right to take enjoyment in what they then would. Equality of overall success in the form we considered it is also subjective in that way. It aims to make people equal in, as we should now say, the amount of degree by which each person could reasonably regret that he was not leading a life he would deem to be a life of great value. That judgment is, in certain ways, it is true, non-subjective. It imposes constraints on reasonable regret that the person in question might himself reject, for example. If that person's assessment of what gives value to life changes over the course of his life, the judgment requires some amalgamation or selection among his different judgments. But the judgment does not allow the computation of someone's reasonable regret to be based on assessments of value in life that are wholly foreign to him, that he would reject even if fully informed of the ordinary facts. I shall now mention a version of equality of overall success that is more objective in just that way, however. Someone might propose that people be made equal in the amount of regret that they should have about their present lives. Dworkin, yes. Sovereign virtue. On this revised test, officials would have to ask whether someone who in fact does not value friendship, for example, and believes his life good though it is solitary and without love, and believes this in spite of the fact that he is aware of the comforts and joy that others find in friendship, is wrong. If so, then resources might be transferred to him, either directly or through special education for him about the values of friendship, on the ground that this overall success is low even though he would count it high, at least before the special education takes hold. No, it's just a part of the book. The book's title is Sovereign Virtue, and the very first chapter is Equality of Welfare. I read it because it's in the program of l'agrégation, we say in French, of philosophy, à l'oral. Lycée. I am at La Sorbonne. I study at La Sorbonne. I am a Sorbonne student. Simpler like this. Now we may well object that officials have no. Yes, but in fact it's not really hard. It's just in French, anyone can access college, not the aggregation preparation, but you can enter any college. You really have to be to suck in order not to enter into college. Yes, it's for free, or you just have to pay 90 or now maybe 100 euros, but not for me because I not for poor people, not poor, but if you have a bourse scholarship reason. I don't pay anything, for example. But it's really difficult to get l'agrégation. Very difficult contest. Only 7% of the candidates get l'agrégation. I already passed this exam last year and I didn't have it. Not sure. You live in USA? We have very difficult contests, schools like ENS, okay, or like what we call classe préparatoire aux grandes écoles. But college is really, it's not high level in French college. Well, compared to other countries, precisely. I think even La Sorbonne now is not very well classified. I don't know how you say this. Compared to other college in other countries. But in philosophy, it's very difficult in France. It's the subject where it is still very difficult to be a teacher and to have the contest to be able to be a teacher. Because in mathematics or French literature, for example, it's very easy now because no one wants to be a teacher in math and literature because of the behavior of the students and the students' parents, mostly. To learn French. In literature, I think my favorite classic in French literature is Madame Bovary by Flaubert. Because it's really fun, in fact, Flaubert. After Dworkin, Madame Bovary, it's, Mrs. Bovary. Emma Bovary. After Dworkin, I will read La logique ou l'art de penser d'Arnaud et Nicole. We could translate logics or the art of thinking. You're welcome. So, now we may, I was there or not? Yes. Now we may well object that officials have no business relying on their own judgments about what gives value to life in redistributing wealth. We might believe that such a scheme for redistribution invades autonomy or is in some other way foreign to the correct liberal principles. But we need not consider these objections, because this more objective version of equality of overall success meets the same argument we used against the more subjective version. Any pertinent test of what someone should regret about the life he is in fact leading, even on the best rather than his own theory about what gives value to life, must rely on assumptions about what resources an individual is entitled to have at his disposal in leading any life at all. So the objective version, like the subjective version, must assume an independent theory of fair distribution, and has no more power to justify giving some people more and others less than what they are entitled to have under that theory. Both versions are self-defeating insofar as they recommend any changes in the distribution independently, under some other theory of distribution shown to be fair. I should just mention, though very briefly, another putative conception of equality of welfare that might also be considered an objective conception. This supposes that a person's welfare consists in the resources available to him, broadly conceived, so as to include physical and mental competence, education, and opportunities, as well as material resources, or, on some versions, more narrowly conceived so as to include only those that are in fact, whatever people think, most important. It holds that two people occupy the same welfare level if they are both healthy, mentally sound, well educated, and equally wealthy, even though one is for some reason malcontent, and even though one makes much less of these resources than the other. This is an objective theory in the sense that it refuses to accept a person's own judgment about his welfare, but rather insists that his welfare is established by at least certain kinds of basic resources at his command. Equality of welfare, so interpreted, requires only that people be equal in the designated resources. This version of equality of welfare is therefore not different from equality of resources, or at least equality in some resources. It is rather a statement of equality of resources in the misleading language of welfare. The abstract statement of equality of resources, of course, as I said, leaves open the question of what counts as a resource and how equality of resources is to be measured. These are the complex questions left for Chapter 2. But there is no reason to think that these questions will be easier to answer if we tack on to the ideal of equality of resources the rider that if people are equal in resources, on the correct conception of that ideal, they will also be equal in some objective concept of welfare. 7. An ecumenical suggestion. I must now consider what might seem a wise and ecumenical suggestion. Perhaps an attractive conception of equality of welfare can be found, not exclusively in one or another of the different conceptions we have now inspected and dismissed, but in some judicious and complex mix of these. In that case, the strategy I followed in the last 3 sections might be the misleading and fallacious strategy of divide and conquer, rejecting each conception of equality of welfare by supposing that unless that conception tells the whole story, it may be wholly ignored. Perhaps the ideal of equality of welfare may be considered fairly only by treating the different unrestricted and restricted versions of equality of success and equality of enjoyment, each as strands to be considered in a complex package rather than as isolated theories. It would be foolish to say in advance that no new conception of equality of welfare could be described that would make that ideal attractive. We must wait to see what new conceptions are presented. But it is perhaps not foolish to suppose that no successful conception could be formed using the conceptions we considered as components in some larger package. In any case, my arguments were intended to reduce confidence in that project. I did not argue simply that no one of the versions I discussed is satisfactory on its own, or that each leads to unappealing consequences if unchecked by some other. My arguments had been of that character. They would indeed invite the suggestion that these conceptions might be combined so as to supplement or check the shortcomings of each alone. But I meant to support a more radical criticism, that we have no reason to accept any of these versions of equality of welfare as a theory of distributional equality, even pro tanto. It is of course desirable, in some sense at least, that people's overall success be improved, though philosophers and politicians might disagree whether the subjective or objective versions of that goal should be controlling when the two conflict. But, for reasons explained, neither version can provide other than an ideal of self-defeating principle of equality in distribution. Nor, for the same reasons, can either figure as useful components in some complex package of conceptions of equality of welfare. In so far as equality of overall success figured even as one component among many, it would figure because some independent test of fair distribution was assumed, and it could not recommend, nor could the package overall, any deviation from that independent test. The other conceptions of equality of welfare we considered we rejected for different reasons. We found no reason to support the idea that a community should accept the goal of making people more equal in any one of these different ways, even when it could do so without damage to any of the others. If that is so, then it is unlikely that it should accept the goal of making people more equal in some way that is composite, or compromise among these different ways. Combinations and trade-offs are appropriate when a set of competing goals or principles, each of which has independent appeal, cannot all be satisfied at once. They are not appropriate when no goal or principle has been shown to have independent appeal, at least as a theory of equality at all. 8. Expensive tastes. I said at the outset that equality of welfare, even as stated simply in the abstract, without specifying any of the conceptions we later distinguished, seems to produce initially troubling counterexamples. The most prominent of these is the problem of expensive tastes, a term I shall use most often to include expensive ambitions as well. Equality of welfare seems to recommend that those with champagne tastes, who need more income simply to achieve the same level of welfare as those with less expensive tastes, should have more income on that account. But this seems counterintuitive, and I said that someone generally attracted to the idea would nevertheless wish to limit or qualify it so that his theory did not have that consequence. I want to return to that suggestion now, not because the problem of expensive tastes is of practical importance in politics, but for two different reasons. First, many readers initially attracted to some conception of equality of welfare may suspect that the arguments I directed against their favorite conception in the last several sections would have less force if a limitation or qualification suitable to exclude the expensive tastes consequence had been built into my description of that conception. I think that this suspicion, if indeed it exists, is mistaken, but it is nevertheless worthwhile to consider, for this reason alone, whether such a limitation is in fact possible. Second, there will be readers who are left unpersuaded by my earlier arguments, but would nevertheless abandon their favorite conception of equality of welfare if they believed that it could not in fact be qualified so as to avoid that consequence. We must be careful to distinguish, when we consider possible qualifications of any such conception, the compromise of a principle from its contradiction. The compromise reflects the weight of some independent and competing principle. A contradiction is a qualification that reflects instead the denial of the original principle itself. The question I want to press is this: can the principle of equality of welfare be compromised under any interpretation of what equality of welfare is, in such a way as to block the initially counterintuitive results of that principle, like the proposition that people with champagne tastes should have more resources? Or is any qualification capable of bearing those results rather a contradiction that concedes the final irrelevance of the principle? Imagine that a particular society has managed to achieve equality of welfare in some chosen conception of that ideal. Suppose also that it has achieved this through a distribution that in fact, perhaps just by coincidence, gives everyone equal wealth. Now suppose that someone, Louis, sets out deliberately to cultivate some taste or ambition he does not now have, but which will be expensive in the sense that once it has been cultivated, he will not have as much welfare in the chosen conception as he had before unless he acquires more wealth. These new tastes may be tastes in food and drink. Arrow's well-known example of tastes for plover's eggs and pre-phylloxera claret. Kenneth J. Arrow's marginalist utilitarian notes on Rawls' theory of justice. Or they may, more plausibly, be tastes for sports, such as skiing, from which one derives pleasure only after acquiring some skill, or, in the same vein, for opera, or for a life dedicated to creative art or exploring or politics. Can Louis be denied extra wealth taken from those who acquire less expensive tastes or simply keep those they already have, without contradicting the ideal of equality of welfare that his community has embraced? Let us first consider how we might explain what Louis has done. No doubt people often put themselves in the way of new tastes carelessly or on whim, without considering whether they will really be better off if they acquire these tastes, or even perversely, knowing that they will be worse off. Even when they think they would be better off, they might be mistaken. But I want to suppose that Louis is not only acting deliberately rather than inadvertently, but is also acting on the basis of the kind of judgment I said people often make when they form and change their preferences. He's trying to make his life a better life in some way. This does not make his claim for extra resources any more appealing or less counterintuitive, I think. On the contrary, the fact that he is acting so deliberately in his own interests seems to make his claim, if anything, less appealing than the claim of someone who tries an expensive experience on a whim for the pleasure of the moment and then finds that he is hooked. Louis will, of course, have his own ideas of what makes a life better, of where his own essential well-being lies. If his society has chosen one of the discrete conceptions of welfare, such as enjoyment or relative success, however, as the welfare in which people should be equal, then Louis cannot think that his own well-being consists in the maximum amount of welfare in that conception. If he did, his behavior would make no sense. This means that one possibly appealing description of what he has done must be wrong. Many people, first hearing this story, might assume that Louis cultivates expensive tastes in order to steal a march on others, so that it would reward improper efforts if he were to receive more income. But if stealing a march means acquiring more welfare than others in the chosen conception, then this is impossible. Of course, someone might pretend to like plovers' eggs though he hates them, in fact, in order to gain more income, and then spend that income secretly buying more hens' eggs, and thus more enjoyment than others can afford. But the problem of expensive tastes is not the problem of fraud. That problem must be handled separately in any society based on equality of welfare, because someone could, after all, pretend to be crippled. If Louis sets out to acquire a taste for plover's eggs so that, if successful, he will in fact have less welfare on the chosen conception if he does not have them, then he cannot purpose to gain some advantage in that form of welfare over others by this decision. He may of course think that he will in the end get more welfare in that conception from $1 worth of plover's eggs than from $1 worth of hen's eggs, costly though the former are. In that case, he knows that his income will be reduced if he is successful, or he may think that he will not gain more welfare per dollar by cultivating a taste for plover's eggs, but rather less. In that case, he knows that his welfare, as always on the chosen conception, will decline overall, though not by much in a very large community, because the total welfare that can then be produced, of which in the end he can expect only one per month, will decrease. It would be absurd to think that he sets out to reduce his own welfare in order to have a larger income, either absolutely or relative to others. After all, though he may have a larger income than others, they are, by hypothesis, no worse off in the chosen conception of welfare than he is, and he is at least by some degree worse off than he would otherwise have been. Louis does, as I said, suppose that if he cultivates his new taste his life will be better. But this is because he does not accept that the value of his life is measured just by the welfare in which his society has, for some reason, undertaken to make people equal. It is hard to see how the fact that he has this opinion can justify either the suggestion that he has acted improperly, or the decision not to give him more resources, but rather to leave him unequal to others in the chosen conception. The choice of that conception was society's choice, not his, and society chose that people be equal in it, not the other conception that Louis values more. After all, there is no reason to think that people were equal in welfare on Louis's conception even before he developed his new taste, and he may still have less than others have of that even if he's brought back to equality in the chosen conception. Louis thinks, as I said, that his life would be a more successful life overall, would provide less reason for regret, if he had the expensive taste or ambition even at the small cost in welfare in the chosen conception he would lose if society re-established equality in that conception for him. Indeed, he might think that his life would be more successful overall even if society does not re-establish equality for him. People develop expensive tastes even in our own society when they must bear the increased costs themselves. Suppose the chosen conception is enjoyment. If Louis develops a taste for plover's eggs, he must believe that a life of satisfying expensive tastes is a better life overall, in spite of the fact that it will provide less enjoyment, and might believe it better even if it would provide much less enjoyment. These may, in fact, be plausible beliefs, or at least they may be plausible if we substitute for the contrived examples of plovers' eggs the sorts of expensive tastes that people do seem to cultivate deliberately and in their own interests, such as a taste for sports that follows from developing skill or a desire for practical power that follows taking an interest in the public will. It is plausible to suppose that beliefs of that sort figure even in the best accounts of why people in our own economy develop the less admirable expensive tastes, champagne tastes, that figure in the usual examples. For if someone like Louis wishes to lead the life of people in New York magazine ads, this must be because he supposes that a life in which rare and costly goods are savored is a life better because it knows a greater variety of pleasure, or more sophisticated pleasures, or indeed simply pleasures that others do not know, in spite of containing less pleasure overall. This explanation of Louis' behavior challenges the importance of the distinction we have thus far been assuming between expensive tastes that are deliberately cultivated and other aspects of personality or person, such as native desires or socially imposed tastes, that affect people's welfare. For the explanation suggests that such tastes are often cultivated in response to beliefs about what sort of life is overall more successful, and such beliefs are not themselves cultivated or chosen. Not, that is, in any sense that provides a reason for ignoring differences in welfare caused by these beliefs in a community otherwise committed to evening out differences in welfare. I do not mean that beliefs are afflictions, like blindness, that people find that they have and are stuck with. People reason about their theories of what gives value to life in something of the same way in which they reason about other sorts of beliefs. But they do not choose that a life of service to others, for example, or a life of creative art or scholarship, or a life of exquisite flavors, be the most valuable sort of life for them to lead, and therefore do not choose that they shall believe that it is. We may still distinguish between the voluntary decision someone makes to become a person with certain tastes, or to lead the sort of life likely to have that consequence, and his discovery of tastes and ambitions that he just has. But the distinction is less important than is sometimes thought, because that decision is rarely, if ever, voluntary all the way down. If Louis' society aimed to make people equal, not in one of the discrete conceptions of welfare we have thus far been assuming in his story, such as enjoyment or relative success, but in subjective overall success, then we would need a somewhat different account of why he would develop expensive tastes, and of whether it would be fair to deny him extra resources. Extra resources. I argued earlier that any attractive version of equality of overall success must provide a place for the idea of reasonable regret, and that this idea in turn presupposes some independent non-welfare theory defining a fair distribution of resources. If this is right, then no one could claim extra resources for expensive tastes in a community ostensibly governed by equality of overall success. If his share of resources is fair before he cultivates his new taste, his share remains fair after he has done so. But since I want to offer independent arguments in this section, I shall assume that my earlier arguments are unsound and that an unattractive subjective version of equality of overall success can be developed that is not self-defeating in that way. But then, since the chosen conception is now overall success, we can no longer say that Louis acts as he does because he believes his life would be more successful overall, though less successful on the chosen conception. Suppose that before Louis conceived his expensive taste, he was satisfied that his life was roughly as successful overall as everyone else's. He then came to believe that his life would be more valuable if he cultivated some expensive hobby, for example. We must ask what he now thinks about the value of the life he had before he formed that belief. He may think that, though his earlier life was just as good as he thought it was, and would remain so if he could not pursue his new hobby, it would be much better if he could. In that case, the problem of expensive tastes does not arise. For Louis is claiming additional resources in order to have more welfare than others under the chosen conception, and he does not have even a prima facie claim to that. But he may instead have changed his beliefs about how valuable his life was. He may have read more widely or reflected more deeply and come to the conclusion that his former life, for all its former appeal to him, was in fact a worthless and insipid life. He wants to cultivate new and more challenging tastes to repair the defects in his life as he now understands them. He asks only the resources necessary to make his life as valuable in his eyes after they have been opened as other people find their lives. How can a society committed to equality in this respect deny him these resources? It cannot say that he was wrong to continue to reflect on how best to live. An unexamined life is for that very reason a poor life. If Louis had reached his present opinions about value in life before the initial distribution, he would have received then the resources he now seeks. Why should he be refused them now? Uh, why should he be refused them now and be condemned to a life he finds less valuable than everyone else finds his? If the chosen conception is some objective version of equality of success, rather than the subjective version discussed in this paragraph, the situation is different still. If the change in Louis' tastes has the consequence that his life is now objectively more successful, then he should have fewer rather than more resources. If, because Louis' convictions are mistaken, the change makes his life objectively worse, then the claim that someone might make on his behalf for still further resources for re-education seems especially strong. But I am assuming that the objective version of equality of overall success has little appeal for a liberal society, so I shall not pursue this line. We might summarize the position we have reached in this way. If If the chosen conception is one of the discrete conceptions we considered, other than overall success, then Louis is attempting to improve his welfare and some other conception he values more, while retaining equality in the chosen conception. But if the chosen conception is what really matters for equality, and if in any case others may already have more welfare in the conception Louis prefers, what ground does society have for now refusing him equality in the chosen conception? If the chosen conception is overall success, which is assumed, arguendo, not to be self-defeating, then if a claim for extra resources arises at all, it arises because Louis now believes that the earlier distribution was based on a mistake. He asks no special advantage, but only that society reach the distribution it would have reached if he had been able to see more clearly then. What ground could society have for refusing him that? One ground perhaps suggests itself, which is the ordinary utilitarian principle that average welfare in society, which we should understand to mean welfare in the chosen conception, should be as high as possible. If society rewards people who develop expensive tastes by giving them extra resources with which to satisfy these tastes, then people will not be discouraged from doing so. But expensive tastes, by definition, decrease the total welfare that can be produced from a given stock of resources. So the independent principle of utility justifies a compromise with the principle of equality of welfare by recommending that people not be brought to parity of welfare if they develop expensive tastes, in order to discourage them from doing so. If the chosen conception is a discrete conception, this means that people are to be discouraged, for the sake of average utility, from bringing it about that they will need more resources to achieve the same welfare, even though they may think that their lives would be more successful if they did bring that about. If the chosen conception is overall success, judged subjectively, then people are to be discouraged from re-examining their lives in a way that might leave them dissatisfied with the value of the lives they have. But in fact, the principle of utility does not explain what needs explaining here. I can at best explain why compensating those who develop expensive tastes is inefficient. It cannot explain why the ideal of equality does not recommend doing so. It is, after all, a familiar idea in political theory that a just society will make some compromise between efficiency and distribution. It will sometimes tolerate less than perfect equality in order to improve average utility. But the compromise intuitively demanded by the problem of expensive tastes is not such a compromise between efficiency and equality. It is rather a compromise within the idea of equality. Our difficulty is not that, though we believe that equality requires us to pay Louis more because he has forced himself to like champagne, we must deny him equality in order to protect the overall stock of utility. Expensive tastes are embarrassing for the theory that equality means equality of welfare, precisely because we believe that equality, considered in itself and apart from questions of efficiency, condemns rather than recommends compensating for deliberately cultivated expensive tastes. I should also point out, parenthetically, that it is far from plain that the utilitarian principle, by itself, can even provide an explanation of what it does purport to explain, which is why a society that does wish to compromise equality for efficiency would select expensive tastes as the point of sacrifice for equality. Refusing to compensate people who develop expensive tastes will protest average utility only if it succeeds in discouraging at least some people from developing such tastes who would otherwise do so. It is impossible to predict how much of such experimentation would take place in a society dedicated to equality of welfare, even without this kind of de- deterrence, or how effective the deterrence would be. After all, people develop expensive tastes even in our own society when they do not receive extra resources when they do. It is also impossible to predict the long-term consequences for utility under any particular assumptions about the success of the deterrence. Any society bent on using non-compensation as a deterrent must set a fairly articulate policy that stipulates reasonably clearly when people whose tastes and ambitions change will be compensated and when they will not be. How would the policy distinguish, for example, between tastes that are deliberately cultivated and those that simply steal up on people? What level of expense, what level of efficiency in producing enjoyment, for example, per dollar cost, would be stipulated as making a taste expensive rather than inexpensive? Beer may very well be less expensive in this sense than champagne, but it is also more expensive than water. Suppose the community responds to these difficulties by refusing to compensate for new tastes if people take any positive steps to acquire them, or even act in a way that they should know makes their acquisition more likely, whenever these tastes are any more expensive than the tastes, if any, that they replace. If this policy succeeds in discouraging experimentation in tastes to any marked degree, then it might well end, for all we know, in a dull, conformist, unimaginative, and otherwise unattractive community, and a community with a less long-term utility as well. Very interesting point. There are many reasons for predicting that latter consequence, but I shall mention only the two most obvious. First, some tastes that are expensive when taken up only by a few people become inexpensive, produce more utility per dollar than present tastes, when they become very popular through the example of those few. Second, a society that does become dull and conformist is a society in which no one takes much pleasure in anything, who cares very deeply about achieving the goals that have been taken mechanically from others rather than developed for himself. It is of course not plain that this policy of non-compensation, tacked to a general principle of compensation for tastes acquired in a less voluntary way, would have these consequences. But that is because no hypothesis about what levels of utility would be achieved by such a society, so different from our own, is worth much, which hardly recommends this explanation of why an equality of welfare society that is also utilitarian would refuse compensation. So the supposed utilitarian justification of our intuitive conviction that equality does not require that those who deliberately cultivate expensive tastes have equal welfare after they have done so fails on two grounds. We still lack a justification for that conviction. But suppose someone now argues in the following way: it is true that people do not choose their beliefs about what would make their lives overall more successful, but they do choose whether and how far to act on these beliefs. Louis knows, or at least ought to know, that if he cultivates some expensive taste in a society dedicated to equality of enjoyment, for example, and is compensated, then that will decrease the enjoyment available for others. If, knowing this, he chooses the more expensive life, then he does not deserve compensation. He is no longer a member of the company of those who deserve equal enjoyment in their lives. Louis has a choice. He may choose to keep the presently equal resources as said he had, and settle for a life with the enjoyment he now has but without the tastes or ambitions he proposes to cultivate. Or he may keep his present resources and settle for a life that he deems more successful overall than his present life, but one that contains less enjoyment. It is quite unfair that he should have a third choice, that he should be able, at the expense of others, to lead a life that is more expensive than theirs at no sacrifice of enjoyment to himself just because he would, quite naturally, consider that life a more successful life overall than either of the other two. The reason why Louis does not deserve compensation is not that the more expensive life he might choose is necessarily a worse life. He might be right in thinking that enjoyment is not all that matters, and that a life poor in enjoyment may be, just from the personal standpoint, a more successful life overall. We say only that the first two choices are rightly his, but that the third is not. I myself find this argument both powerful and appealing. It is also an important argument for the following reason. The objection to allowing Louis the third choice described is most naturally put this way. Louis should be free, at least within the limits allowed by a defensible form of paternalism, to make the best sort of life he can with his fair share of social resources. But he should not be free to trespass of the fair shares of others, because that would be unfair to them. But of course, once the point is put that way, it cannot stand simply as an argument for a compromise to equality of welfare tailored to the problem of expensive tastes. For the idea of fair shares cannot then mean simply shares that give people equal welfare in the chosen conception, because that is exactly the conception to which Louis appeals in asking for extra resources. If fair shares are shares fixed independently of that conception, however, then any compromise using the idea of fair shares becomes a contradiction. Can the idea of fair shares be defined for this purpose in some way that does not make the shares that produce equal welfare in the chosen conception automatically fair shares, but nevertheless uses that conception in some way that avoids contradicting it? Suppose someone's fair share is taken to be the share that produces equal welfare in that conception. I would produce it if the person in question had not deliberately cultivated an expensive taste. This will not help, as we saw, if the chosen conception is overall success, and if Louis believes that the life he would lead if he did not cultivate new tastes would be a life of less overall success than others believe their lives to be. Even if the chosen conception is one of the discrete conceptions, such as enjoyment, defining fair shares in this way will not help. The argument I said I found powerful uses the idea of fair shares not simply to describe the limitation on inequality or on equality of welfare it recommends, but also to justify that limitation. It proposes to explain why, in spite of the various objections I made earlier in this section, independent and non-contradictory considerations of fairness justify a compromise of equality of welfare. But if the definition of fair shares just assumes that the compromise in question is for some unspecified reason fair, then the appeal to fair shares can itself provide no justification that is not immediately circular. If the idea of fair shares is to do any work, then it must appeal to some independent account of fairness in distribution, and any independent account contradicts the conception to which it is attached, as I said, because it occupies all the space that conception claims for itself. I might add that I think that the most plausible independent account, which I myself had in mind when I said that the argument against Louis' third choice was powerful, is some conception of equality of resources, though of course there are others available, including, for example, the principle that resources are fairly distributed when those with more merit have more. Perhaps ingenuity could produce some explanation or interpretation of the argument in question, that Louis does not deserve more resources just because he has chosen a more expensive life, which does not use this idea of fair shares or any similar ideas. But any such account would, I suspect, fall before the following further example. Imagine now a society newly dedicated to equality of enjoyment, in which, when resources are redistributed in order to achieve equality of enjoyment, Jude has far less money than anyone else because his wants are so simple and so inexpensively satisfied. But one day, perhaps after reading Hemingway, he decides that his life, for all its richness in enjoyment, is a life of less overall success than it might be, and proposes to cultivate a new taste for some challenging sport, such as bullfighting. Bullfighting. Suppose that after he does so, he finds himself seriously frustrated by his lack of funds with which, for example, to travel to Spain, and asks for more funds through a further redistribution, after which he would still, as things fall out, have less than anyone else. Do we now have any grounds for saying that he is undeserving of the increase, when we know that if it is denied, he will have both fewer funds and less enjoyment than anyone else? I doubt anyone will want to say this. But if so, then we cannot say that the reason Louis is undeserving of an increase is simply that the taste he has cultivated is expensive. Jude's new taste may be just as expensive. The difference is that Louis asks that more than an equal share of social resources be put at the disposal of his life, while Jude asks only that something closer to an equal share be put at the disposal of his. We need the idea of fair shares, in this particular case the idea of an equal share of resources, in order to express the force of this difference. Suppose that if Jude is given more funds and can travel to Spain, he will have not merely as much as but more welfare than anyone else. In whatever conception has been chosen, including overall success, though he will still have much less money than anyone else. Does equality now require that he be denied the additional money? If not, then Jude's case makes an even stronger point. Not only may Jude re-establish equality of welfare in spite of the expensive taste he has deliberately cultivated, he may even succeed, by developing such a taste, in having more welfare than others. In both cases, it is the idea of equality of resources that is doing the work. I hope the moral of this long section is clear. If someone begins anxious to defend some version of or conception of equality of welfare, but also wishes to resist the consequence that those who develop expensive tastes should have more, he will come in the end to a very different theory of equality. He will find that he must presuppose some other theory that makes his conception of equality of welfare either idle or self-defeating. That is, of course, exactly the conclusion that we reached in studying certain of these conceptions separately. It remains to consider, in the next section, whether there are strong reasons for nevertheless trying to find some small room for equality of welfare within a general and different theory of equality. 9. Handicaps. I considered, at the beginning, the immediate appeal of the idea that genuine equality is equality of welfare. One aspect of that immediate appeal may easily have survived the various doubts I have raised, which is apparent power of equality of welfare to explain why people with physical or mental handicaps or with other special needs should have extra resources. Surely, it might still be said, this is because they are able to achieve less of something that falls within the general ambit of welfare than others are on the same share of resources. Perhaps we care about the handicapped because they are able to achieve less enjoyment or relative or overall success, or perhaps it is some discrete combination of these, or all of them. But some tug toward equality of welfare under some interpretation must be part of our intuitions about the handicapped. If so, then this fact might be thought to show that any final theory of equality must provide at least some space for equality of welfare, though perhaps only as a supplement to or qualification of another theory of equality, if only to capture the provisions we insist on making for those who are unfortunate in this particular way. But it is far from clear that some welfare concept is needed to explain why the handicapped should sometimes have more material resources than the healthy. In the next chapter, I shall describe a different approach to the problem of handicaps which does not rely on welfare comparisons, but which might explain this equally as well. There is no reason to assume, in advance of considering this and other suggestions, that only a welfare-based theory of equality can provide the account that is necessary. In fact, and moreover, a welfare-based theory can provide only a less satisfactory account than might at first appear. The argument we are now considering is that equality of welfare deserves a place, at least in any general theory of equality, because it so accurately captures our intuitions about how the handicapped should be treated in the name of equality. But is this true? It does seem plausible to say, on any conception of welfare, that people with severe handicaps are likely, as a class, to have less welfare than others. But this is of course true only statistically. In many cases, those with handicaps have in consequence less income, and therefore do not have even equal material resources with others. And some people with appalling handicaps need extra income just to survive. But many people with serious handicaps have high levels of welfare in any conception, higher than many others who are not handicapped. That is true, for example, of Tiny Tim and Scrooge. Tim is happier than Scrooge, approves the way the world is going more, is more successful in his own eyes, and so forth. Mr. Scrooge. The intuition I spoke of, however, that those with handicaps should have extra resources, is not limited to those among the handicapped who do, in fact, have lower than average welfare in some conception. If Tim had as much money as Scrooge, when perhaps Tim's welfare would be greater than Scrooge's by an even larger margin, but Tim nevertheless did not have enough money to afford physiotherapy, many of us would think him entitled to extra resources for that purpose. Now, of course, we might believe this only because our intuitions have been schooled by the statistical fact. On this hypothesis, we feel that the handicapped as a group should have more because their welfare is as a group lower, and we then apply the general intuition to individual cases without checking to see whether the general rule holds. But I do not find that a persuasive account of why we feel as we do. but I do not find that a persuasive account of why we feel as we do. If, when we know that someone handicapped is not particularly low in welfare, we still believe that he's entitled to extra resources in virtue of that handicap, then this belief is poorly explained by supposing that we have lost the power to discriminate. So our beliefs about the handicapped are not in fact justified so accurately or powerfully by the idea of equality of welfare as to suggest that any general theory must on that account include some measure of that idea. The lower welfare explanation of these beliefs has further shortcomings as well. Suppose that the welfare, on any interpretation, of an entirely paralyzed but conscious person is vastly less than the welfare of anyone else in the community, that putting more and more money at his disposal would steadily increase his welfare, but only by very small amounts, and that if he had at his disposal all the resources beyond those needed simply to keep the others alive, he would still have vastly less welfare than they. Equality of welfare would recommend this radical transfer, that is, until the latter situation was reached. But it is not plain to me, or I think to others, that equality, considered just on its own, and without regard to the kinds of considerations that sometimes might be thought to override it, really does require or even recommend that radical transfer under these circumstances. I do not claim as this last observation recognizes that any community that embraced equality of welfare in principle would then be committed to the radical transfer. Some other principle the community also accepted, for example, the principle of utility, might recommend some compromise with equality here. But where should the line be drawn? It might perhaps be left to the practical politics of intuition to draw such a line. But then the victim of total paralysis might well receive nothing at all. The equality principle would in itself offer no reason for the community's accepting an initial utility loss to do him some good that would not also apply to doing him more good, at least in the circumstances I describe in which the marginal utility to him of further transfers does not much decline. The principle would offer almost no guidance to the community here, beyond a call for help equally strident over the whole range of possible transfers to this victim, a call too impractical to honor in full and too unstructured for principled compromise. Now suppose different facts. There is an expensive piece of equipment that would enable a paraplegic to lead a much more normal life, and the community can afford that equipment at great but not crippling sacrifice to its other needs and projects. The community votes to levy a special tax to provide this machine for him. But he is an excellent and dedicated violinist, and he replies that he would rather have a superb Stradivarius, which he could purchase with the same funds. Can the community properly refuse to the paraplegic refuse to honor that choice? See T.M. Scanlon's discussion of this problem in Preference and Urgency, Journal of Philosophy. On any of the conceptions of welfare we might choose, the paraplegic's welfare might in fact be increased more by owning the violin than by having the machine. Even if he knew all the facts he would prefer to have it would bring him more enjoyment, make his life both relatively and overall more successful in his own eyes and objectively. The independent principle of utility would recommend the same choice, of course. But these facts would be embarrassing to a scheme that was not committed generally to equality of welfare, and allowed that ideal only a limited place in order to handle the special problem of handicaps. For consider someone else, not handicapped, who has a low level of welfare on all the same conceptions. He takes little enjoyment from his life, counts it a failure, and so forth, just because, though he has the same amount of wealth as everyone else not handicapped, that is not enough to buy the Stradivarius he covets above all else. If the paraplegic is allowed to use his extra funds to buy the violin, that other person might properly complain. The paraplegic treats the transfer not as the occasion to remove or mitigate his handicap, but simply as an opportunity to increase his welfare in other ways, and the other violin lover would seem to have, in his low state of welfare, as much claim to do that as the paraplegic has. But if the community denies the handicapped person that use of his extra funds, and requires him to buy the machine instead, its position seems perverse. It grants extra funds to him just on the ground that this will increase his lower than average welfare, and yet denies him the right to increase his welfare with those funds as much as he can. 10. Welfarism. If I am right in the various arguments I have made here, then equality of welfare is not so coherent or attractive an ideal as it is often taken to be. We therefore have reason to consider with some care the alternative ideal of equality of resources. But it is worth stopping now to consider very briefly whether the arguments I have made against equality of welfare might be effective against other forms of welfarism and, in particular, how far they might be effective against utilitarianism. I am using Amartya Sen's account of welfarism as the general theory that the justice of distributions must be defined exclusively by stipulating some function of individual welfare. A.K. Sen, Utilitarianism and Welfarism, Journal of Philosophy. The different versions of equality of welfare that we have been studying are varieties of welfarism. Utilitarianism, which calls for some maximizing function over some conception of welfare, is another, or rather another group. Two kinds of justification are in principle available for any form of welfarism. A welfarist theory can be defended on the theological ground that the stipulated function of the stipulated conception of welfare is something good in itself, but ought to be produced for its own sake. Or it can be defended as a particular conception of equality, as a particular theory about when people are being treated as equals. The distinction between these two types of groups is reasonably clear, I think, in the case of utilitarianism. That theory can be supported in a direct theological way. Not only is pain bad in itself, but pleasure, or some other conception of positive welfare, is good in itself, and the more there is of it, the better. Or it can be supported as a conception of equality. It is then understood as the theory that people are treated as equals when and only when their pleasures and pains, or components of some other conception of welfare, are taken into account quantitatively only, each in that sense to count as one and only one. Of course, this egalitarian version of utilitarianism cannot, as the theological version can, purport to supply all of a plausible general political or moral theory. The egalitarian utilitarian would have to explain why it is not as good to aim at maximum average misery as maximum average happiness, for example, or why there is anything to regret in natural disaster that kills thousands, though it improves the situation of a few. But he might find this explanation either in a further political principle, which holds that those who aim at others' misery or failure do not show these others the concern to which human beings, at least, are entitled, or in a distinct morality of outcomes, which holds that death or pain or some other kind of suffering is bad in itself, but which uses neither the same conception nor the same metric of welfare as his egalitarian utilitarianism deploys. The arguments we considered against equality of welfare would seem, at least on a first look, equally effective against utilitarianism when it is understood in that second way, that is, as a conception of equality. Once again, we should proceed by stating different interpretations of utilitarianism composed by taking different conceptions of welfare as the maximums for a given community. And once again it will seem implausible only to take gains and losses in enjoyment, for example, or in relative success as the measure of when people are being treated as equals, because people value welfare in these particular conceptions differently. Nor will it be helpful to take gains and losses in overall success, interpreted either subjectively or objectively, as the measure, because, as we saw, these conceptions of welfare depend on already having accepted a different, independent test of when people are being treated as equals. These various arguments are plainly beside the point, however, when utilitarianism is supported in the first way, that is, as the theological theory that welfare in some conception is inherently good in itself. Against that argument, my claim that people cannot be treated as equals by making them equal in some dimension they value unequally is irrelevant, because what is then in question is only whether welfare on that conception is good in itself. I might add that I think that the theological ground of utilitarianism, which my arguments do not touch, is much less appealing than the egalitarian ground, which they do. It is the egalitarian ground, I think, rather than the theological ground, that accounts for whatever appeal utilitarian arguments still have for modern politicians and lawyers. The distinction between these two types of grounds for welfarist theories might seem less plausible when applied to forms of welfarism other than utilitarianism. But it is available at least in principle, I think, and we can construct a theological defense of at least some conceptions of equality of welfare. Someone might say that it is simply a good thing when people have the same amount of enjoyment, for example, whether or not everyone agrees that enjoyment is fundamentally important in their own lives, or even perhaps whether they ought to agree that it is important in that way. The arguments I have offered do not reach equality of welfare taken to be a theory about treating people as equals. Equality of welfare, so conceived, is weaker than we might initially have thought. Is equality of resources stronger? Et donc de la page 65 à la page 119, ce sera Equality of Resources.